Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Melisa Valentine is an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Management Science and Engineering Department and co-director of the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization. Her award-winning research focuses on designing groups and organizations, how the rise of information technology has impacted organizational behavior, and how new technology can improve organizational structures and outcomes. Professor Valentine's work makes contributions to understanding classic and long-standing challenges in designing groups and organizations' deep knowledge of how the rise of information technology has made the possible new and different team and organizational forms. Her most recent study examined how the deployment of new algorithms changed the organizational structure of a retail tech company. Thank you very much, Melisa, and I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to interacting with you throughout the webinar. I wanted to start by putting this research about how data and platforms are changing team design in historical context. I want to talk about sort of what technological trends this research is a part of and how it's important for society and for how work is structured. So what I'm showing here is a graph from a book called The Vanishing American Corporation by Jerry Davis, who's a professor at University of Michigan. So he motivates this book with this story. In 2009, a large retail chain called Circuit City went out of business. Shortly after that, a company called System X bought the Circuit City domain name and ran the Circuit City website, still continuing to fulfill customer orders for electronic goods. But running this website, running the Circuit City domain name, took fewer than 50 employees, in contrast to the 30,000 person workforce who had been running Circuit City previously. So that one story illustrates some of the dynamics of this graph, which again comes from Jerry's book. He has rigorously studied the number of corporations in the United States over time, and he's shown that the population of public corporations is shrinking. There are more who are exiting than entering this population at this time. Those that come into business typically employ a smaller workforce than the ones that are going out of business. So as illustrated here, in 2015, the combined workforces of Facebook, Yelp, Zynga, LinkedIn, Zillow, Tableau, Zulily, and Box were smaller than the number of people who lost their jobs when Circuit City was liquidated in 2009. So there are some macroeconomic trends related to this, including the availability of other kinds of capital. But some of this, and what he talks about in his book, and what my research speaks to, is the way that technology is underlying some of these trends. So what we're going to talk about today is how technologies are changing the basic ways that people organize work and organize businesses. So the historical trends that we're looking at are what we should be thinking about is how work was organized in the past and how technologies are changing that. So what I'm illustrating here is some of the oldest organizational charts in the United States. And what these are speaking to is the way that public corporations grew up really around railroads and around large scale manufacturers. So these kinds of corporations required a huge workforce of white collar professionals who were doing the professional, administrative, and clerical work to coordinate these large-scale operations. So in the past, we had a large workforce doing the coordination and decision-making, and now, increasingly, what we see is that software and different kinds of platforms are doing the kinds of work that the white-collar administrative, clerical administrative professionals were doing in the past. So the main argument of this book is that the technologies that organize coordination and decision-making have changed. So there are a lot of different ways that this conversation is being had, a lot of different ways that people are making this point. So I'll just call out a few before we get into the specifics of Flash teams and Flash organizations, which is what my research is about. So in this paper that I'm illustrating here, which I highly recommend, Jerry Davis talks about the different kinds of robust organizational alternatives that are enabled by new technologies. So for example, peer production, so something like Wikipedia. So when you have a template and the internet, then anyone online can come and edit a page in the encyclopedia And then you have this large crowd that participates in the creation of something new. So that's different than a way that a hierarchical organization is organized and run. So having those kinds of peer production or open innovation platforms is an example of one of the reasons that corporations or organizations are disappearing and shrinking. Others have talked about this in different ways. So for example, I was presenting something like this, and a venture capitalist named Roy Bahat tweeted me an article about how now software is the new organizational chart. So the example there would be something like holacracy or systems of record. So when you have software that sort of underlies all of the decisions and coordination, it really changes the way work is done. So that's kind of the historical trend that we're seeing. This is relevant because most of society, right, is organized around these large-scale organizations, and as they're changing, then the structures of society are changing too. So I'm going to use this as the motivating quote for the remainder of the presentation. So Jerry Davis, having studied the vanishing corporation in the United States, has this sort of provocative way of thinking about this. He says that organizational design is now a subfield of computer science. So I'm going to give you some examples of why he says that, sort of what it means, and then how this idea of using tools and tech for team design fit into this idea. So the first example of organizational design now being a subfield of computer science is the web-based enterprise. So let's start with back at the example of Circuit City. So what was going on there? So the technology that underlies this change is actually not very advanced or revolutionary at this point. As Jerry points out, it's something simple called the application programming interface. And all that means is a way that the front half of the website talks to the back half of the website. So you'll have a customer inquiry on the website that can now do a query to the database. So that was something that used to require a white-collar professional who would check the customer inquiry and then look in the database. And so that's now something that is automated. So his point is that with the API doing a lot of the coordination work, we're going to see an increase in what he calls the web page enterprise. So I'm going to use his favorite example here. This is kind of a whimsical example. It's a new kind of consumer cult product called the Instant Pot. So the point with the Instant Pot is this was a new product category on Amazon that now has over almost 40,000 five-star reviews. And what's interesting about this is the Instant Pot started with a staff of 5 people and an investment of $350,000. So they were able to weave together this ecosystem of online internet resources to create, develop, produce, manufacture, ship, sell, and market this new product. So I'm going to call out this New Yorker article from 2013 by Nathan Heller that sort of explains what's going on here and why we can expect to see an increase in the web page enterprise. So Nathan Heller published this in 2013 after interviewing some people who were working in the Silicon Valley, kind of San Francisco market. And his informant was explaining this. He was saying in 2005, the whole thing exploded. Did you need hardware? No, now you just put it on Amazon or Rackspace. Software? Now it's all open source. Distribution? It's just the App Store, it's Facebook. Customer service? That's just Twitter. You just respond to your best customers on Twitter and get satisfaction. Sales and marketing, now it's Google Words, AdSense. So the cost to build and launch a product went from 5 million to 1 million to 500,000, now it's 50,000. So the revolutionary technology behind all of this is the API. It's a very simple technology, but it makes coordination and decision-making much easier and automated. And we're seeing this used in a lot of different organizational applications now. So I was giving you an example of the web page enterprise, and now let's get into team design, which is the motivation of this webinar. So in this whole arc of talking about how technology changes organizations, what we're seeing now is that you can use APIs basically to interface with a workforce. So we see that in crowdsourcing, and we see that in the Flash Teams research. Let me illustrate a little bit about how that works. So several years ago, a PhD student, Daniela Ritelny, a computer science professor, Michael Bernstein, and a group of other PhD students and master's students, and I did research to develop a web platform called Foundry. So the thing to think about with Foundry is it's a web platform that allows team design. So anybody can come to Foundry, which is an open source platform, and can basically author a Flash team. And then Foundry interfaces with online labor markets, where there are millions of people, millions of workers who are available and registered in Upwork who can come work on the Flash team. So I want to talk about some of the features of this platform and the way that it connects to this overall trend of using more technology to do the coordination and decision-making that people and organizational charts were doing in the past. So an important component or feature of Foundry is that it interfaces with large online labor markets. When we did this study several years ago, we configured Foundry to interface with a labor market called Upwork, so upwork.com. So Upwork has millions of people who are expert in various kinds of professions like web development, mobile app development. We worked with people who were product designers, content creators, editors. We had people who did marketing, business plans. So basically the way that Foundry works is it will issue an open call to the people on Upwork who have registered to work on a Flash team. For the first research project that we did, we were trying to demonstrate that this kind of approach could be as fast as previous crowdsourcing approaches. So we configured Foundry to hire first come, first serve, which will obviously optimize on speed and the efficiency of hiring. And then I'll talk later about different ways to configure the composing or assembling of a Flash team. So basically Foundry interfaces using this sort of like API approach to a large online labor market. And then the people will click on the link and then be brought to Foundry, and then they'll see what their role is in the overall Flash team. They'll see the workflow, they'll see what their first task is, they'll see the way that their task is interdependent with other people on the team. They can upload deliverables, which will automatically pass them along to other people on the team. And then there are different features for the management of the Flash team, which will show like what work is on time, what work is at risk, and the different ways that people can talk to each other. The other feature of Foundry that is interesting for managers who are thinking about team design is that we configured it so that it could be basically like an organizational chart that anybody who was working on the Flash team could edit. So what I'm picturing here on the bottom left, so think of that as a website, a web portal that anyone on the team has access to. So you see sort of the participants of the team down the left side, and then the different tasks that they're a part of kind of next to them. So the way that this works is anyone can make a copy of the organizational chart or the workflow, and then they can make a suggestion. So they'll basically add a task or add a role in their copy. And then when they merge it back in, then everyone else will see what their suggestion is. So what's a cool property about this is it allows for top-down or bottom-up recommendations to how to change the team design or how to change the organizational chart. So if somebody on the front line sees that their team is maybe needing another person, or if they see that the hierarchy isn't working the way that it's configured, then they can make a suggestion on the org chart. And when they merge it back in, then somebody will review it. They'll review what the suggestion is, and they can accept the suggestion, change it, reject it, and then the suggestion will appear on everybody else's page for how the work is going to be structured going forward. So again, there's lots of different ways that you could configure this. You can imagine what would happen if you made this sort of like a democratic vote. Like let's say that somebody makes a suggestion that the hierarchy should be switched up for some portion of the task, and then everyone on the team could sort of vote if that's what should happen. So you can have this like democratic review of the suggestion. The way that we had it configured during the study was to have the managers were the ones who always approved the different suggestions that were edited in. So again, it's interesting to think about this as the platform is now something that is dynamically editable by anyone on the team, and that sort of changes the properties of organizational structures, organizational design, and also the way that those decisions get made. So we ran a proof of concept study to show that this kind of approach could be used to crowdsource really complex projects. So what I'm illustrating here are the different organizational structures that emerged in the 3 different studies that we ran. So each of these started with just the sort of person who's our client, the person who had the idea. So illustrated in the top is sort of this black figurehead. So it started like that, and then over time they would add a different role, a different team, a different hierarchy, and these are the organizational structures that emerged. And I'll show here the workflows that emerged. So each of these tasks was added over time. The colors of the task boxes illustrate the different teams. So for example, in the top, you're looking at one of the projects that we ran, and you can see that towards the end of it, that's when the QA, which is in orange, the quality assurance team came online and started doing all of their tasks. So the other thing that's interesting to think about here with Flash teams and with this kind of archival record of all the work that was done is the kind of data science that can be done on the tasks, the roles, the interactions, the hierarchy. So this starts to enable a lot more data science or sort of empirical analysis of team design, of how the work is structured, of how sort of the work unfolds over time. So I illustrated the web page enterprise and then Flash teams. So the web page enterprise, you're using API to sort of connect different components of a website. With Flash teams, you're connecting a client or somebody who has ideas with a whole team of people using an online labor market and a Flash team, using a Flash team platform like Foundry. What I want to talk about now is some of the later research that we did after we ran the Flash teams experiments, where we were continuing to see what was possible when you use kind of software, when you use platforms to do some of this kind of organizing work. So the next example I want to talk about is different ways that you can use software to sort of think through the Flash team members, who's going to be on the team. So the first example that I showed, we were optimizing on kind of speed and efficiency because we were in conversation with the crowdsourcing research community. I want to talk now about another model that was developed by Nilafar Salehi, who is now a professor at UC Berkeley in the CS department. So she was the PhD student who led this research. And basically her idea was to notice that the work of Flash teams and Flash organizations was basically sacrificing some of the familiarity of team members in order to get speed. So if you're just doing a first come, first serve to a large labor market, that means you're just going to get who's available. You're going to get fast staffing of the team. But what she was wondering is, was there a way that you could staff the team to really focus on the relationships between the team members? In general, this kind of model could be configured in several different ways. You could maybe be optimizing for different kinds of expertise. You could be optimizing for different time zones, different availability, different experience levels. So the variables that we're optimizing here are the speed that we demonstrated with Flash teams in the past, and then with familiarity, with people working together and sort of accumulating a lot of experience working together over time. So basically what she wanted to do with this study was to develop a system, an algorithmic system that would assemble or staff the Flash teams in a way that optimized the relationships of the past. So team members who had worked together before were weighted more heavily when staffing the next Flash team that was being developed. So she developed another platform called Huddler. And Huddler would keep track of all of the times that people had worked together in the past and then use that information to staff the teams going forward. So we ran a study. This is now published and available on her website. So we ran a study that basically showed that using the Huddler algorithm that optimized for both familiarity and availability, we were able to quickly staff flash teams where team members had worked together in the past, which is one of the predictors of really effective teams. All right, I want to now give my final example of how organizational design is now a subfield of computer science. So this is a continuation of the flash teams research stream. So if you think about this kind of overall idea, you have a platform that interfaces with labor markets or even large internal populations of employees, and then convenes teams to work together on a project. So there's different features that we're talking about here. One is the assembly feature, which is figuring out who should be on the team and sort of assembling them together. The second piece is how the platform can help people work together more effectively. So this last example that I'm giving was led by a PhD student named Sharon Zhu, and she was looking at how the platform could interact with team members to help them work together more effectively. So this is the paper that she led. She talked about it as searching for the dream team. So I like this visual because what this is showing basically is the idea of how the platform helps the team members work together effectively. So basically what you're seeing here is 3 different teams. You have A, B, C, and then on the left, you have different kinds of team structures that the teams could use to coordinate their work. So you could have a centralized hierarchy or a decentralized hierarchy. You could have different ways that the team members are interacting with each other. They could have like an emergent kind of interaction pattern. They could have some sort of like round robin or equally distributed interaction pattern. So what you see illustrated here is of the 10 rounds that the teams worked together, they adopted different team structures based on the algorithm that I will talk about in just a minute that was recommending what structures they should be using. So what's interesting about this research, I think in particular, is it is a really nice illustration of the kind of technical innovation that's needed for this kind of work, and then the kind of basic social science or like managerial intuition that's needed for this kind of work. So what Sharon was sort of speaking to when she was leading this project is a sort of known body of research in organizational design or management about how to structure teams. And what all of this research has shown is that there's basically not a universally ideal way to structure a team. It's going to depend on who the team members are, what kind of tasks they're working on. Is it like an execution task or an innovation task? So knowing this and sort of being familiar with this research, she developed this algorithmic approach that was going to explore all of the different spaces that teams could use to structure and then recommend different ones to the team leads or to the managers. She ran an experiment that showed that the teams that were sort of running with this dream team system outperformed the manager-led teams or the self-managed teams by about 40% in this one experiment. So the different structures that could be recommended to the teams are sort of listed here. So there are a bunch of different ones that they could look at. I talked about hierarchy and interaction patterns. I'll notice at the bottom, there's one, feedback norms. So people could be encouraged or recommended to give really encouraging feedback or really critical feedback. So this is sort of the space of all the different structures that the teams could use to facilitate or coordinate their work. This is sort of the decision space that the managers and team members were exploring to figure out how they should be working together, how they should structure their work. So the way that this worked is she configured basically a Slack bot. And the Slack bot so the team members would come into Slack and they would be interacting with each other and they would play a game for one round. at the end of the round, the Slack bot would collect feedback from all of the team members about how things had been going. And then using that data, the Slack bot would then recommend that they stay with the same structure that they had before or try and experiment with a new structure. So you can see an example here. This is one of the actual teams that was running. So you can see the team member is kind of joking around and is saying, I'm too scared to type anything. And then the Slack bot recommends that they adopt a very cheerful, encouraging way of giving feedback to each other. And then after that, the team members, again, this is kind of joking and interaction with the bot, the team members are saying like, go team, we're killing it. So this kind of like feedback, evaluation, recommendation, feedback loop is the kind of thing that we're thinking about here. And what the algorithm was doing to sort of run the bot behind the scenes was figure out if the bot should recommend staying with the same structure or trying a new structure. And what Sharon found in the study is basically so the dream team teams outperformed the other teams. So when she dug into some of the dynamics of what was happening there, she saw that when the managers were running the team, they weren't trying enough variations. They sort of found a structure that worked and just stayed with that structure. So the dream teams outperformed the manager-led teams because they explored more structures. And then the self-managed teams, or the teams that kept getting recommendations about how to change, they changed too often, which gave the team members started to ignore the recommendations because it was too many recommendations and too many changes. So the dream team algorithm had this way of sort of figuring out how much to explore versus how much to sort of stay with the same structure that had been working in the past. So in general, the dream team bot interface is just this proof of concept of the idea that now that teams are increasingly working on platforms and everyone's sort of interacting in this platform, the platform can be configured to have these kinds of like latent measurements of feedback or how things are going, sort of a latent collection of data, analysis of data, and then some sort of recommendation to try to help the teams perform better. Now, obviously, across all of this, there's going to be, it's going to be really important that whatever platform, whatever algorithm is being designed is done in collaboration with the people who it's acting upon. Otherwise, there will be a lot of kind of gaming or not using the system. So it has to be something that is working for the people that it's trying to help instead of some sort of like top-down tech design, which tends to get ignored, subverted, or gamed. So those are the examples of how team design is now happening increasingly on platforms using data for assembling teams, for helping them coordinate, and how this sort of allows for different properties of the teams. They're happening, increasingly outside of organizations or in these sort of optimized ways within organizations. So I wanted to conclude on this slide, which is sort of, what do you take away from all of these kinds of studies and this kind of future of work conversation? And across the number of different studies that we've done, or the different kinds of conversations that we've been having with different leaders of organizations, here's sort of the takeaways. This is kind of where I see things, this is where I see the conversations sort of happening and getting a little bit stuck in organizations. This is opportunities, basically. So the first is, all of this data can be used for making decisions in kind of smarter, more optimized ways. Data can be helpful. But what I see as sort of the limit in a lot of organizations right now is actually access to data or to data infrastructure. So a lot of the managers that I talk to will sort of be bought into this vision of how software and how data can be used for organizing and for coordination. But basically, it's hard to get it done in their company or in their organization just because the data infrastructure is not there. Like, people don't have access to data. They the tools or the access to the data in non-siloed ways to sort of do this kind of optimized decision making. So investing in access to data and sort of like a really broad, open data infrastructure seems to be a capability that a lot of people are working on right now. And then part of that is now that managers in different occupations are using data to do things like team design, team assembly, to support team coordination, or just other kinds of decision making like market research or things like that. I'm seeing a lot of conversation about companies and occupations needing to develop a new kind of data fluency. So people who were not necessarily having to use data for the kinds of decisions they were making in the past are now needing like data curriculum. What is like an A/B test? What is, data science 101? The second takeaway, I think, for managers that I'm seeing as a result of all of these technological changes is that people are needing new processes for thinking about how to manage the boundary of the firm. What I mean by that is, like, Upwork is this large online labor market of really expert people. And then there are companies that are interfacing with online labor markets, or sort of like, it's another way of thinking about outsourcing. So I'm seeing a lot of conversation around how organizations can interface with the crowd, can interface with online labor markets, can interface with freelancers or people who are sort of working outside of the organization. There are some really important social implications and policy implications that are part of a larger conversation. For the purposes of this webinar, what I'm seeing is that people are talking a lot about how to manage the boundary of the firm and how to sort of coordinate with the crowd. The last piece of it is a lot of this is new, a lot of it is emergent, a lot of it is changing, and there's a lot of cool opportunities. So there's not really a thou shalt or like a right way to do this at this point. What I'm seeing be the most successful is companies that are investing in kind of human-centered design around this and looking for really kind of tight feedback loops in trying something, doing some sort of like co-design with workers, with the employees, and figuring out how to configure these things in a way that supports work and that supports workflows and helps people kind of do the kind of work in the way that they want to, in a really what we're kind of virtuous feedback loop. So these are the kinds of problems that I'm seeing, and a lot of the examples of the conversations of how to sort of start to think about using software for organizational design and team design in organizations. And I look forward to continuing conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Melisa, for this very informative presentation. It's such a timely and important topic. I think it'll really help everyone. The first one is, your paper on flash teams stated that this method can be used for engineering and design work, but is there a limitation on the type of work that these kinds of methods can be used on? And do you plan any future research on different types of work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That reminds me of something that I had wanted to mention, actually. We're seeing a lot of different examples of now industry use cases of something like flash teams. So for example, there's a San Francisco startup called Gigster that does software and engineering. So that's similar to what we were talking about. But there's actually a lot of other models that I'm seeing. Some cool examples include, there's something called Artella. Artella is artists. So they're digital artists who do, they sort of have like, the way that the founder explained it to me is they have like the Pixar workflow, but then they have like a community of people who do digital animation who can come participate in the different projects that each other pitch. There's something called Catalan, which does this kind of model for business plans. So it's basically a network of like MBAs. So if you need to do a flash business plan, then you can interface with MBAs who do this. So I've seen it, and as I've given this presentation, I've heard people have ideas for like flash teams of accountants for like audits. So I think for project-based work, we're going to see an increase in this kind of idea of like platform-mediated projects. So I think it works well for project work. I think the open question, and this is something that we've thought a lot about as well, the open question is, what does the sort of maintenance of whatever the deliverable was. So if you have this like body of code, if you have like the sort of like, you know, the code that of the mobile app, like who maintains that over time when you have this kind of Flash model. So the idea of the like core team that stays on and maintains versus like the peripheral team that in a Flash comes and helps participate in building something out. So I think that ends up being the where we're thinking about where innovation would have to happen, or like new thinking would have to happen, is in just like the maintenance of longer projects, because this works best for the kinds of like short Flash projects that I've been talking about.
Thanks. So here's a more general question. So teams have always been used to get work done. So why aren't we better at it? And why does technology make a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's an important one. And it's what I'm thinking about with that question is when I assign team projects in my classes, then it's to groans, it's met to groans. Nobody likes working on a team because you end up with all the social problems of, you know, maybe some people are working harder than other people. You know, maybe you have some like funky hierarchy where the person who's most expert is not the one who has the authority. So all of the like social, psychological problems and challenges of groups remain. Technology does not solve that at all. Sometimes technology can make it worse. We've seen with like virtual teams and online teams that research has shown tend to have more conflict than others. So I will say, you know, sometimes teams can be better than working alone when you have like a synergistic team where you're like bouncing ideas off each other and you're really like working together in this innovative way. That's the dream. And I don't think that technology in any deterministic way gets you from like the bad team to the good team. So the point is good. The point stands. Teams are hard.
So has your research found any way to control for the quality of the final deliverable?
So thank you. Again, that's a really good question. When we did the Flash Teams field experiment, one of the challenges that the clients, so they were the ones who had the idea of what they would build using the Flash team. So they were very concerned about the quality of the product that was being built. And what the feedback that we got from them is that that is definitely a place where the interface between an existing organization, where you oftentimes have a lot of kind of like quality checks and quality assurance built in place, that's where that interface can be kind of problematic or a place to really watch for. So again, it's a really important question, and I think it's the right kind of thing to be thinking about. In our study, the solve for it was simply around hierarchy. It was simply around having like managers being the ones who were accountable for whatever was turned in and for kind of checking it. So I have seen kind of studies, or I have seen different proofs of concept where people are looking at like technical solutions for trying to look at how to, you know, assess quality in more like automated ways or whatever. So in our instance, we just use managers. So the managers were accountable for the quality of the product. We had quality assurance teams. So that's the kind of like old school way. Managers armed with technology sort of was the fix. And I think we'll see more kind of studies of this in the future, because it is one of the main problems with crowdsourcing.
Great. So you said something about accountability and setting it up, and it reminded me of this question that was asked. So essentially they're asking, if leadership or managers ultimately make the decision to use a digital team, should they also design the process? Wouldn't the project teams do a better job? How do you integrate knowledge and decisions?
Yeah, good question. So the managers should not design the team. I agree with you. I think we are in radical agreement here. So I think one thing, so we had a Flash team study maybe 5 years ago, and then the one I was presenting is a little newer. So the one we had done initially, we used a a workflow where everything was designed up front. So that would be something more like a manager making all of the decisions for like how things should be structured. For very, very simple execution, it was kind of fine. But what we saw is that like one task into those flash teams, the workflow was obsolete. This sort of like top-down design of how things should go was already like out of date, obsolete. And then the people who are actually doing the work had to improvise, and they went very much like off platform and just improvised a better way to do it that fit their style, that fit their expertise, that fit the deliverable better. So that's actually what led us to work on the new functionality in Foundry that allows for this kind of editing over time. So now a manager, like the client who has the idea, basically just starts with like a blank slate and then hires people, and then they themselves edit, add teams, add tasks, kind of decide what should happen over time. So it is much more emergent and much more kind of team member designed together over time. There were some challenges with that. Like we got feedback from the team members that sometimes they wanted more direction from the client manager and sometimes they wanted less. So it still is a little bit of a balance. But the functionality that I would sort of look at there is the idea of kind of like co-designing the workflow, co-creating the structures together over time with some sort of dynamic interface.
So we have, I was just re-reviewing. So we have several questions on concerns about IP and data. So how do you address those kinds of concerns when working on a Flash team or using a Flash team for work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So intellectual property is another really kind of key issue around this Flash team model. When we did the study, we just followed the Upwork policy for intellectual property. So Upwork has protections in place. Usually protections, they have policies in place that basically says that the client owns the IP, and there's some ways that they, through their sort of user agreement, deal with the IP issues of having freelancers work on intellectual property of a company or a client. So it's a little bit of a punting the question and just saying that the Upwork labor market had their protections in place, and that's what we were relying on when we did the Flash teams. I think as organizations become increasingly disintermediated, we see more of these kind of platform models, then I suspect there will be changes to policy. I'm not an expert in law, but maybe changes to the way that IP is protected. So it's the right conversation, and I think the future might look different than what we have now.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two more questions that are very common themes through here. So the first one is how should people go about trying to get this kind of work started within a more mature organization? How do they get people to be receptive to this, not feel replaced, still feel like their work is important while also having these Flash teams?
Mm-hmm. So there's sort of two different concerns in that question, and I think both are really valid. One is sort of how to have conversations in large organizations that have an existing way of doing things, and one is concerns about worker replacement and kind of like worker rights, and I think both of those are really, really important. So I'm actually start with the second one first. I think that there is a really broad conversation going on right now about how kind of like this social fabric of our society, not to be dramatic, but kind of like this social fabric of our society. So for years and years, the social safety net has existed around organizations. People have had their entire careers in like a single organization, you know, health insurance, retirement, pension, career ladders. Like post-industrial revolution, society just evolved around organizations. And as that changes, then that means that there's a lot more precarity, and a lot more precarity for workers. And again, that's the right conversation. That should be like the foreground of what we're talking about with any of these like platform models for organizing. So it's just such a larger conversation. Thank you for bringing it up. And I'll I'll note that there's so many places where that conversation is happening, and I hope we all continue to participate in that. In terms of inside organizations, how to start this conversation, what I've seen is that there are people who will hear something like this and they'll sort of recognize that there's like some sort of data source in their organization that could be used for this kind of organizing. And then like a small pilot, like just a small proof of concept that shows how to use those data to assemble a team, or like a small pilot that shows how, I don't know, like a Slack. I mean, Slack doesn't solve everything. This is not me being tech deterministic. But just, I guess what I'm saying is like small pilots to demonstrate proof of concept can start a really interesting conversation. Also, if you're interested in doing research, you can always contact academics, see if you can do a study together, because sometimes that will be a low risk kind of outside of the workflow, the operational workflow way to kind of explore these kinds of ideas. So another idea.
Okay, last one. So how does ideation, innovation, and execution integrate to assign value for different contributions? So would you pay, if you had a base rate, but then certain people within the Flash team were performing at a much higher rate, or perhaps were not performing that well, would you then adjust the compensation?
So it's an interesting question to think about kind of how people's contributions are recognized in different ways. I'll tell you things that I've heard that I'm not satisfied by, but I think, and then I'll say what I think. So I shouldn't say it like that. So in terms of like, because what I would want to avoid with this conversation is basically anything that is like, again, like too like tech deterministic. Like people are always interesting in how they will enact these different social systems. So what I've heard people talk about is different kinds of like micro equity, or sort of like some sort of like, how do you do like equity in a Flash team? So that's an interesting idea, right? If the client has this idea and then people are contributing to the idea in different ways, is there a way to sort of like measure and use data to do equity and sort of like sort of reimburse people, or like or reward people for different, reward people for different ideas? So yeah, maybe that would be cool. I think, oftentimes this is playing out just like in a market system, and capital will have capital and labor is recompensed for labor. So it's part of, I think the overall ecosystem will develop in a way that that sort of changes that conversation in different ways. But I have heard like different like tech ideas about it. So I would just encourage you to like Google like equity for Flash teams or something like that, if that's of interest. But it plays out in the larger ecosystem of startups and like larger organizations and things like that.
Thank you. So people have been chiming in that this was a really wonderful webinar. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time. And just for everyone who's online, I wanted to let you know that Melisa has a course coming out in November on this very topic. So we will provide information with that, with the follow-up email that you will be receiving, which will also include a recording of today's webinar. We want to thank you so much for your time today, and have a great week.